In Chapter 7, we're going to take a look at how we can customize and automate Excel and its environment. And you'll notice on page 215 the title of the chapter is Automating Repetitive Tasks, which in essence is creating a macro to automate those repetitive tasks, and then customizing Excel's environment. The objectives that are listed on page 215, we'll run through these. We're going to learn to record, run, and edit a macro. We'll also learn how to save a workbook containing macros as a macro-enabled workbook. We'll create a macro that is run using a shortcut key combination. And then we'll pin and unpin a frequently used file to the recent workbooks list. We'll also add and remove buttons for frequently used commands to the Quick Access toolbar. We'll hide the ribbon to increase space in the work area. We'll also customize the display options for Excel. We'll customize the ribbon by creating a custom tab and adding buttons. We'll create and apply custom views. We'll create and use a template. And then finally we'll look how we can customize save options for auto recover files. And as always, we have model answers that are found on page 216. And we're going to begin project 1. Actually is the project where we'll look at creating macros. And again, a macro is a series of instructions stored in sequence that can be recalled and carried out whenever the need arises. And typically you create a macro when you find that your task that you do is repeated frequently. And by saving those instructions within a macro, it not only saves you time, but it'll ensure that the steps that you've recorded are consistently reapplied, which in essence allows you to avoid errors in data entry, formatting, or other worksheet objects. So that gives you a little bit more explanation and background of macros on page 217. And just keep in mind that when you create a macro, you do want to have kind of a plan in place, because as you click and type within the worksheet after a macro has been created, it's recording and clicking every keystroke, whether or not you really want that included in it or not. So just make sure that you use as few as clicks and keystrokes as possible. As mentioned previously, we are going to learn to save a workbook that has a macro in it as a macro enabled workbook. And you have to do that because by default the normal Excel file cannot store a macro code. And they indicate to us too that a macro code is VBA macro code, and VBA stands for Visual Basic for applications, but that's a certain type of language that I'm not real familiar with, nor do I really want to learn that language. It's a programming language, but as we record macros, that that program, the language, is actually writing your macro, and it's doing that in the background. And we'll look at the Visual Basic screens and the areas where those single lines of instructions have been recorded, and we'll do a little bit of editing, very minimal editing to the Visual Basic code, but we will see how you can go in and modify a macro. Honestly, if you've got an error in a macro, for the most part I would probably just delete the macro, start it over again, and allow your computer to record those steps on your own. As we begin project 1A, we're going to assume that we work in the accounting department at a large company, and the company has a documentation standard for all Excel workbooks that require that each worksheet show the department name, the author's name, the date the workbook was created, and a revision history. And so since that occurs on every worksheet that we are supposed to have, we decided that we're going to create a macro that will insert row labels for that data to standardize the documentation. And so we're going to do that by opening up a blank workbook, which I already have here, and we're going to again record a macro that will provide that documentation. We're going to click in cell C4, and the reason for that is we want to make sure that as part of our macro we instruct the macro to take the active cursor to cell A1, and so that's why I'm clicking outside of A1. It could be anywhere actually in the worksheet, but we don't want to be in cell A1. Alright, so to start the recording of a macro, we're going to go to the View tab, and in the Macros group you'll see the Macros button. I'm going to click on the bottom portion of the Macros button, and then I'm going to choose Record Macro. That brings up the Record Macro dialog box, and in that dialog box we are going to put a name of the macro, and they actually put in an abbreviation for this, but I'm going to go ahead and spell it out. You just can't have spaces in the macro name, so that's why we're squishing that together, but it's going to be accounting documentation. Shortcut key we're not going to apply yet. You'll notice it's going to store this macro in the, it says the personal macro, but we need to switch that so that it shows just this workbook. It's going to store the macro in this workbook, and although they don't mention this that I found in the paragraphs, when you put a macro in this workbook rather than in a personal macro workbook or a new workbook, if it says this workbook, then you have to have this particular workbook open in order to run any of the macros within it. So just kind of an FYI there. For example, if I create this macro and then tomorrow maybe I want to run the macro in another workbook, I have to have this workbook open. It doesn't have to be displayed on the screen, but it has to be open and in memory. It could be minimized as a button in order to run it in another workbook. So just something to keep in mind there. There are ways of getting around that. They just don't necessarily address it in this chapter. Alright, and then the description, kind of lengthy here. I'm just going to say accounting department documentation. Now they have additional information that you find on page 219, and I'm going to forego typing all that in, but you can see in step 2E at the top there they have who it was created by and the date at which it was created, which I think is very important to put in there. I've skipped over that for right now. So once you have the name and where it's being stored, you can put a description, which is optional actually. Doesn't have to be in there, but you do have to have a macro name. So we'll click OK. The macro has begun, so anything that we point and click on, any text that we type, it's actually recording that. And you'll notice here on the status bar, notice the little button here, it says the macro is currently recording. Click here to stop the recording. You can do that. There's another option. We can go back under the macro button and stop recording. But our first step is to go back to the cell A1, so I'm going to press Control Home. And at that point we're going to type in the label Accounting Department. I'm going to press Enter to go to cell A2. We're going to type in Author. Press Enter, Date Created. These again are all labels. And then Revision History. And then we're going to press Enter 3 times, which will allow you 2 blank rows there, and then they would start wherever the worksheet is cell A7. Alright, and that's all we need to do, and then we're going to stop recording. Again, you can click here. You can also go back up to the macro button and stop recording. We're going to go ahead and click here in the status bar. That stops the recording. And then we're going to save this workbook. I'm going to the File tab, choose Save As, and we're going to save it like we normally do. Excel Level 2, Chapter 7, Project 1, and then we're going to call it Macros. And then the Save As type at the bottom, rather than an Excel workbook, we need to save that as an Excel macro-enabled workbook. Notice it kind of eliminates any other workbooks that we've seen up there in the list because we don't have any other macro-enabled workbooks. So it's only showing the ones that are macro-enabled. Alright, and then we'll go ahead and click on Save. And that will save all the Visual Basic codes within the workbook. Now, to run the macro, we're going to test this. I'm going to clear out what we have in here, and we're going to start in some other cell besides A1. And then to run the macro, we'll go back to the View tab, Macros group, click on the bottom portion of the Macros button, and then View Macros, view the macros that we already created. Notice accounting documentation is in there. And then we're just going to click on Run. And that will not only take you back to cell A1, but it'll go ahead and type in the labels for us immediately, and it places the active cursor in cell A7. All right. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead, save this again, and then we're going to close out of the file, leaving that with a blank screen there. Then they want us to go through the steps of opening that macro again. So I'm going to go back to the Open button. All Excel files are in there. Notice the macro that we named. It's got a slightly different icon than the other workbooks, but that is the one that we want to open up. I'm just going to double click. When we open up any workbook that's macro enabled, you'll notice there's a security warning. By default, macros have been disabled. We want to enable those macros. We only have one, but it will enable us, so if we want to use it, we certainly can. And then we're going to go through and create a macro that has a keyboard shortcut with it, and this macro will change print options for a worksheet. It's actually going to switch it to landscape and then also scale it to fit to one page. And so by default right now, if you'll notice, okay, it's portrait orientation. Okay, so to record a macro, we can go back to the View tab and choose the bottom portion of macros, and that's totally fine. But once you've created a macro and recorded one, then you have the little button in your status bar that you can use. Notice it says no macros are currently recording. Click to begin recording. And so you can certainly do that as well. So we are going to use that button, something a little bit different. This is just an option. Whatever is more convenient for you is fine. That'll bring up the Record Macro dialog box, just like we saw before when we went through the Macros button before. The name of the macro is going to be Landscape Scaled One Page. And then the shortcut key combination is going to be ultimately Control-Shift-0. But to get that to come up, we're just going to press Shift-0. Notice it automatically puts the control in there with it. So in order to run the macro, we're going to have to press Control, Shift, and 0. And then it has the description down there. Change the orientation to landscaped. And again, there's more text to be typed there. If you look on page 222, step 3D will give you additional information there, which again tells who created it and the date at which it's created. All right, so we're going to click OK, and now the macro is recording, and we're going to go to the Page Layout tab, and we're going to launch the Page Setup dialog box. And within that, the orientation, we're going to click on Landscape. And we want it to fit to, and by default it picks up on the 1 by 1, which is good. That's what we want. And then we'll click OK, and then we need to stop recording. You click on the Stop Recording button in the status bar, and that'll stop recording. Now, since we ran that macro or recorded that macro in this particular workbook, if we do a print preview, it's all set already to landscape, and if it were more text than necessary there, it would fit it to one page. Okay, so to test it, what we're going to do is start a new workbook. And keep in mind, I already have this one open, so it's going to run on a new workbook. And I just want to say one more thing here. If I'd close out of that other workbook, then I would not be able to get to the macros. These would not show up. Okay, so that other macro has to be open and in memory. All right, now to test it, let's go ahead. I want to type just a few things in here just to get some text on there. And right now, if we do a print preview, notice it's in portrait. Now to run the macro though, we can go back to the View tab, click on Macros, View Macros, and either click here and run it just like we did before, or to run that shortcut key combination, we can press Control Shift and 0, and that's just what I did. Control Shift and not 0 but the O, the lowercase o. Now when we preview it, it switched it to landscape, so it did run that macro successfully. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. We're not going to save it. That does take us back to the workbook that's got the macro in it. And then next we're going to take a look at editing the macro that we have, and actually the accounting documentation macro, rather than having 2 blank lines between it like we had before, we only want to leave 1. So we're going to do some just real simple editing in the Visual Basic Editor. And so to get to that, we're going to go back to the View tab, go to the Macros button, again View Macros, and then we want to edit the accounting documentation macro. So make sure that that's selected. I'm going to go to the Edit option. And you'll notice now we're in Visual Basic. Now I'm not sure how much you can see of that, but you can kind of tell that it's gone back to toolbars, and there's some other areas here. But you can see that we're looking at Module 1. This is in Visual Basic Editor. Like I said, I don't think you're going to be able to see a whole lot of the other information within the window, but you get the idea, and you can do this on your own as well. And you'll notice here there's sub and end. The sub indicates the beginning of the procedure. The end represents the end, obviously. The information that's in green are comments regarding the macro. Anything that has an apostrophe above it, none of those are going to be recognized as part of the macro. Okay, so it'll be ignored when the macro is run. And then all these other ones are the actual instructions for the computer to run the macro. Alright, and so what we're looking at, you'll notice after revision history is the A7. That's where it's going to end up. We want to change that from A7 to A6 so that when we run the macro it'll end up in cell A6 rather than A7. Okay, and that's really the only change that we're going to make. You could go in and do some simple editing with text, like if you misspelled something you could go in and make a change there. But again, like I said, if it's getting too involved, I would probably just delete the macro and re-record the macro. You can see how easy it is to create a macro, and it would probably take less time than going through and trying to edit the macro. But once you're done, I'm going to click on the Save button, which you can't see this, but it's on the toolbar at the top. I'm just clicking on the Save button, and then we're going to close out of the Visual Basic Editor. And again, I know you can't see this, but there's a File menu. Click on the File menu, and there's an option to close and return to Microsoft Excel. And that takes us back to the workbook. And then we're going to test it again. I'm going to delete out the text here. I'm going to click somewhere outside of cell A1, and then we're going to run the macro. So I'm going to click on the Macros button, View Macros, Accounting Documentation, and I'm going to run that. And this time it ends up in A6 rather than A7. Okay? Alright, and as I mentioned before, if you maybe have a bug, a lot of times if you don't create a macro correctly, it'll say it's debugging your macro and it doesn't work properly. If you get to that point, or if you decide you don't want your macro within the workbook anymore, you can delete macros. And doing that, again, you're going back to the View tab, the Macros button, View Macros, and then you just click on whatever macro it is that you want to delete and click on the Delete button. Okay, one other thing I want to mention here too, if you want to assign a shortcut key to a macro after the fact, like if we want to go back and assign a shortcut key to accounting documentation, we just click on that, go to Options, and then notice you can assign a shortcut key just like we did when we were recording initially. Okay. Alright, so that's how you go about recording a macro and running the macro. So anytime you find yourself in a situation where you are repeating tasks that are pretty simplistic, you might want to consider creating a macro.